Dr. Sergey Shubin. Dr. Shubin is the director of the Center for Migration Policy Research, Swansea University. His research interests are on the geographies of poverty, mobility, and inequality. He has served in various capacities across the universities in Europe, that's Russia, France, UK, and Canada. He is a member of the Global Research Partnership in Aquaculture and a member of Ecosystem Services for Poverty Alleviation program. He has published several high-ranking papers in journals.
I want to say thank you to CIBA, who are our collaborators on this project, Pakonza, which we are working on in Bangladesh and India. And I want to say thank you in particular to Dr. Vijayan and to Dr. Shihar and his team, Dr. Karthik and Dr. Bhagat. So today I'm just going to talk about the results of this project, which we've been doing in different parts of India and Bangladesh. But I want to start with the very typical description of stereotypes which exist about poverty. So what I want to do is to make you think about how poverty and aquaculture are related. So very often what we hear when we think about the words poverty are certain images, certain ideas about how a poor person looks. It often comes to the appearance, for example, old clothes, and often comes to stigmatization, exclusion of those people who appear poor. So we've got two quotes here. One from India, which from V, who says, "I have some old clothes. If I wear them, villagers see me and say that I'm so poor." And another one from Bangladesh, which says, "Even if there was poverty, we didn't let anyone understand that we starved for days." So some of these ideas about poverty are very common. We see that poverty is often linked to lack of food, lack of resources, and lack of clothes. And they're used as a sign to marginalize poor people. And what we see is that, however, some of these signs, some of the elements of poverty which people describe to us, sense of stigmatization, sense of disappointment, do not appear in the programs which deal with anti-poverty measures and alleviations. So what we see is often the government programs tend to focus on particular measurements and better measurements of poverty. So the focus in India in particularly is on complete elimination of poverty by trying to find out the best approximate measure of it. So recently the guidelines have been changing slightly, so the average poverty in urban area was shifted slightly from 972 rupees per month to 1,000 rupees per month. In Bangladesh, very similar picture, the focus is on poverty alleviation. And again, what we see there is the use of specific measures, probably about $1.25 per month, sort of an average international measurement of poverty, which is applied in different contexts. And in this situation, it's very often that the shrimp farming is used as the way of alleviating poverty. It's seen as a way to encourage people to develop their economic opportunities and to make ends meet. It's often seen as the opportunity to provide, as the Bangladesh Ministry of Planning here says, well-paid employment to the poor. Sorry, my things fell. So what happens in our work is we're trying to go beyond this very simplistic measurements of poverty, which don't often take into account the actual experiences of people. What we want to do is to think about poverty which is changeable, which is not easy to measure, something which escapes measurements, because measurements only taken at certain times of the year, for example, only in the beginning of the year, don't take account of poverty which then changes within the next 6 months. We also think about something which is not necessarily rational and cannot be easily described in terms of poverty. So what we try to do is to focus on 3 things here today in my talk, is focusing on complex poverty, so something which is not necessarily related to people. And this is particularly relevant to this conference because what we're trying to do is to think about the role of fish, aquaculture, and how it produces different kinds of poverty. Then we look at the dynamic poverty, poverty which is changing. And again, we've seen so many great talks here talking about the dynamism of aquaculture communities, which affect inevitably the livelihoods of people, and they're making the evaluations of poverty dynamic. And also non-rational poverty, trying to think about different ways in which poverty can be expressed. So I'll start by looking at the complex poverty, which is not necessarily linked to humans. So here, what I want to talk about is the way in which poverty consists of different elements, something which is not necessarily limited to material expressions. We all kind of know, and there are lots of experts here who will tell me that aquaculture systems are very complex. They depend on temperature, they depend on humidity, they depend on salinity. And in the same way, poverty itself is something which is composed of different elements, where the role of each element and the connections between these different elements define the final product, define what poverty is. So poverty in this case is something which cannot be really easily categorized, cannot be simply measured because it is so complex. It consists of different measurements. So here, as a quote, for example, from a particular participant in India who talks to us about the fact that poverty can include other things rather than just material elements. So he says, do you think alcohol is an important in poverty increase? He says, yes, if they put 2 fish seeds in the pond and then fishes will become 250 grams, they draw the fish from the pond, sell them and drink alcohol. So yes, how will the poverty be removed? So the issue here is beyond the measurement itself. So poverty cannot be easily described, named and measured. As one of our participants from Maharajganj area in Uttar Pradesh says to us, we cannot completely remove poverty through fish farming. And so we cannot really rely on people only in defining what poverty is. Why? Because, as I say, the system is complex. It involves other elements, fish, climate, and so on. But however, a lot of people we talk to also mention to us that poverty is bigger than a person who is poor, and often refer to God, something which is kind of otherworldly, bigger than life, something which cannot be described. So in this case, poverty is something which depends on something else. And these quotes which you have here illustrate this point. So V from India says, when asked about fish farming, if fish farming can remove poverty, he answered, no, it will not remove it. I think if God will not wish it, how will it be removed? Another quote from India, if somebody has stolen my fish, it doesn't decrease my income. God has written our destiny. So people kind of resign to their fate. And in Bangladesh, Allah is with us and helped us to live on even though we still have few loans to repay. So here what we see is that the sense of kind of understanding of poverty which stretches beyond human, something which includes other elements, something which is not easily described. God cannot be described. God is otherworldly. God is beyond words. The second thing which I want to talk about today is the dynamic poverty. So I already talked about the fact that poverty is often measured at certain intervals. And as a result, what we miss out is on the changes which happen to poverty in between these intervals. So poverty is a process. It's not an entity. It's not a thing which can be moved from one place to another. It's not a piece of paper. So very often, poor people are seen as pawns, which are kind of transported from one place to another and expected not to change. Instead, poverty is about development, is about movement towards something else. What we're trying to do is to think about how the fixed elements of poverty, which are often described in terms of income, occupation, mobility, are there, but there's also something else which happens there, which we want to capture in this work. So, for example, a quote from Bangladesh says to us, in fish farming, you never know what is in store for you. Another quote, now I'm getting old. I think that will happen if I'm unable to look after the family for 5 days in a row. So he's talking about poverty happening to him. And V from India says, if we will work, we earn. If we find any labor work, we do it. Otherwise, we will stay home. If we will have food, we will eat, otherwise we will stay hungry. So there are lots of references here to if. What will happen? How things will develop? And participants often talk about this poverty in this case of uncertainty. If it happens, how will it be? The word if highlights the future uncertainty and the potentialities of poverty, how poverty develops. It explains that the focus here is not necessarily on what is now, but something which is happening later. So for example, quite a lot of people we talk to rely on loans to support their everyday living. They take up loans, and what really worries them is not necessarily the money which they don't have, but how in the future will they deal with these loans and repayment of these loans, something which is very problematic. So quite a lot of our participants talk to us about the fact that what they're stressed about is not their current situation, but what will happen when the time to repay a loan comes. So this sense of future, the sense of poverty being in the future, is very obvious in many of the quotes which we collected during the field work in Uttar Pradesh and also 2 areas in Bangladesh. And poverty as a result is often linked to hope and risk. So if it is displaced into the future, it is often about hope. R from India talks about the fact that if any year I face crop failure, even then I will not stop farming. So he continues doing things even though he thinks it can be problematic. He continues kind of with this, with the fish farming. Here, luck, fate, and destiny are used synonymously to describe the way in which participants see themselves as helpless. They're stretching into uncertain future, trying to combat the uncertainty with hopefulness that their fate and luck will change. So people often rely on their children, for example. Here it says, children are doing hard work. Let's see what they become. Children are often seen as a way of escaping poverty. Another quote from Bangladesh says, in fish farming, there is profit as well as loss. Whatever it is in a fate. And a participant from India say, you can say I'm happy because we cannot find anything more than our luck. So luck, belief, fate, destiny are the key things here. And the picture here is illustrative of this approach. It's taken in a participant in the Mymensingh region in Bangladesh, where a person, when we ask them, how do they deal with poverty, how do they deal with the risk which is associated with fish farming and disease, they took out all the different medicines which they had bought on advice of a local fisheries officer and displayed them to us and saying, we have them all, none of them work. So we spend a fortune on these medicines, and unfortunately, we just don't know where to go anymore. So they said, we just continue going on despite this. So perhaps there's an issue of application of these medicines, perhaps there's an issue of proper techniques, but people get disillusioned and they start to believe in luck and hope beyond these kind of approaches. And the last thing which I want to talk about is the feeling of poverty, something which is often not captured in the traditional measurements of poverty and those approaches which I described to you, official definitions of poverty. So poverty has often been complained to us to darkness or a virus, and this is very symptomatic because the work we're doing in the Braqcon project is about the effects of the virus and disease in fish on poverty. So my colleagues are trying to deal with the scientific approaches to alleviate this disease and improve the situation. But our respondents also talked about poverty itself as a virus or disease, something which relates to darkness. V from India says, because of poverty, there is no happiness in this house. My house is filled with darkness. Another participant from Bangladesh says, if there is poverty in the house, then the two of them quarrel. And the last one says, inside me, I was always poor. Quite a lot of people talk to us about the fact that poverty means to them more than the material things. So one participant, a farm manager in Bangladesh, a respected person, talked to us about the fact that he has to show the appearance of not being poor. For him, the feeling of shame was central to the experience of poverty. So he was saying that, he has to have a motorbike because he's a farm manager. So there's a picture of this motorbike on the slide. He says, because he's expected to be well off, he's expected to do better, he doesn't want to feel ashamed that he doesn't have enough money. So even though he struggles to make ends meet, he's always stressed. He's talking about the fact that he doesn't share the stories of poverty with his family. He doesn't tell them that he's actually struggling. And for him, this is the very interesting situation. He says, effectively, he is jealous of those people who have nothing because they do not have stress of shame and stigma which he has. So it's not just about poverty. So even those people who have nothing in this case, he puts them, he says their poverty is less important than his one. So what I want to do is to finish with some of the suggestions about how we can adopt a different approach to understanding poverty and think about the way in which aquaculture can be central to addressing some of these poverty concerns. First, I would like to think about hybrid poverty. And there's quite a lot of work here, which was presented earlier on today, which talked about assemblage, combination of different things in relation to fish farming. So I want to use the same kind of assemblage approach to understand poverty, thinking as poverty is something which consists of these different elements, like fish assemblage consists of different elements of fish, temperature, humidity, and so on. Here, I want to go beyond poverty stereotypes and think about other elements like shame, darkness, concern, something which is adding to this experience of poverty. So people who are ashamed but have money may be poor differently. I also wanted to think about spatially and temporally displaced poverty here. I've already talked about the fact that for many people, it's not the immediate present which concerns them in relation to their poverty experience, but it's the future. It's about what's going to happen to them later on. It's about that moment of the need to repay the loans which they borrowed. So we want to think about poverty as temporarily displaced into the future, but also linked to the past. So a lot of people again talked to us and said, it's about the memory of being poor, which haunts me. It's about the fact that I can never escape the categorization, stigmatization attached to me in a particular village, that I have always been poor. Spatially, poverty is often displaced into other areas. This picture is drawn from the storybook which we co-developed with our participants in the Shadkiri region in Bangladesh. So this is a drawing made by the artist, which builds on the stories told to us by the children, primary school children, in a particular school in the Shadkiri region. And what these children told us is a story of separation. They told us a story which is very common in that particular part of Bangladesh, quite a very disadvantaged area, I should say, where families often have to survive by sending most capable members away. So in this case, it's a picture of a father who leaves their family because he has to work first in Dhaka and then abroad. He eventually went to the Gulf states. I think he works in Dubai. And a sense of separation, a sense of break is here described through this kind of scarf which a father has. And the child is hanging on to it, trying not to let his father go because the family is being broken down because of poverty, because of the need for this father to go and travel somewhere else. So here, poverty is spatially displaced. It's no longer simply in that village. It is in Dhaka, where this father works, or in Dubai, where he has to go further to earn his living. And lastly, what I want to talk about, and very quickly, is about poverty beyond reason. So something which is not necessarily rational. Thinking about the role of God, to which a lot of participants referred to us. It's different God, obviously, in different parts of our research areas, in India, in Bangladesh. But yet, they're talking about that external force, something which defines their luck and fate, and very often kind of stops, makes them accept their poverty situation, but also affects the way in which they go about daily living. So it's important to take these different elements of poverty into account and not just focus on the simple measurements which are used to define poverty in relation to aquaculture. Thank you very much.